Well, it wasn't just Detective Linda Arndt. I also interviewed Detective Steve Thomas, and you have him featured prominently in the documentary as well. He wrote a best-selling book about how John and Patsy did it and how he thought it was Patsy who murdered her own daughter. And
what you've just seen and heard is Detective Steve Thomas being mocked on national television, basically reinforcing the mockery from episode 2 of the Netflix documentary. Is this mockery justified?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. There is a lot of cynical, contemptuous, gleeful, eyebrow-raising and head-shaking in this snippet by the know-it-all, we-know-better journalists.
He thought it was Patsy who murdered her own daughter, and the Ramseys sued him. And in the documentary, you play tape of the deposition that he's forced to give in this lawsuit before he and the publisher pay money to the Ramsey family. And you can just see him being confronted with, I'm sorry, how do you think this worked? And he has no explanation.
That's right. Incomplete.
I'm a little confused. So Steve Thomas was sued and his publisher was sued. Is Steve Thomas's book out there? Is Steve Thomas's book available for purchase? Yes or no? Well, the answer is yes, it is. So if he was sued because he was so stupid and so silly, and what he said was so defamatory and so untrue, why is his book still out there? And it's not out there because all references to Patsy have been censored. I have a copy on my desk right now. Let's go to page 368. Alex Hunter said that he thought Patsy Ramsey was involved. That was more than offset by comments from his deputy, blah, blah, blah. And then a little further down, he refers to Dan Schuller, the new DA investigator. I think he interviewed Burke Ramsey. He told us that he had once been married to a southern woman named Patsy. That's how people act in the South, he said. Being from Arkansas myself, I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Now, I think they both actually have a point to make there. Dan Schuller, I think, is really referring to this thing of wearing makeup and the appearances thing. But I think one can also say Patsy behaved in certain ways that were quite strange, especially when you see her on CNN in that first interview, the hands in front of the face. And if Patsy wrote the note, I don't think that's something all Southern women do. Now, if I had to boil it down, that is the one crucial area. I mean, there are several areas where I disagree with the detective, Steve Thomas. But it's in this one area above all that I think Steve Thomas is wrong. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the hundreds, thousands of you who have subscribed. If you want deeper analysis than you're getting on YouTube, you can either head to Patreon, the $3 tier, where you can get a whole bunch of articles in the archive. And then also I've got around half a dozen audiobooks on Patreon. But for a super deep dive, you're really going to have to buy some of the books on Amazon. Not all of them are available in paperback, and not all of them are available as audiobooks at this point. My recommendation is that you start with Christmas Starts, the most recent book I've written, or start at the beginning with The Craven Silence. It's also the most reviewed book that I've written on the Ramsey case. Meanwhile, if you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. If you've never hit the thanks button and you're enjoying this content, please consider doing that. Really appreciate it. And let's get started. So what is this crucial aspect that I think Steve Thomas is wrong about? Well, it's this idea that whoever wrote the ransom note killed John Bonet. If that's your point of departure, and it is for many, and you're wrong, well, then you're ultimately going to be wrong about everything, even if you are right about a few things. And what do we say on this channel?
When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
My theory is quite simple. Whoever authored the ransom note killed the child.
Would you agree that whoever authored the ransom note probably killed the child?
I would agree 100%.
I would agree with that.
Okay, now.
Steve Thomas agrees, Patsy agrees, and John agrees. I don't think that's true. Do you? Also, if you believe in the intruder theory and you think the intruder wrote a cockamamie note making up all this malarkey about a foreign faction, two gentlemen watching over her, the house being monitored, and John Bonet is safe and unharmed at this time, the note itself proved not to be true in the fullness of time in terms of actions speak louder than words. There was no call to collect the ransom. No ransom was ever paid. No one was actually taken from the house. And curiously, Alex Hunter also used the phrase "at this time," right? In the ransom note are the words, "Your child is safe and unharmed at this time," or words to that effect. Alex Hunter also used the phrase "at this time" when he made his insufficient evidence bologna sandwich in October 1999. There is such a lack of critical thinking in the Ramsey case, even within the best narratives of this case. And I think one way to be more effective thinkers is to think about thinking, is to understand how the thinking evolved. What were those original notes that were off that eventually destroyed the whole symphony? And I've just revealed one of them to you, this idea, this assumption that whoever wrote the ransom note killed John Bonet. What if we have another assumption? What is an alternative theory on this? In this analysis, I want to deal with two dimensions. Firstly, this idea that criticism of Steve Thomas is fair. And if he was sued, well, then surely criticism of his book is fair as well, is it? Because as far as I'm concerned, it's really not. And we'll quickly look at a few of the books in the Ramsey Pantheon, and you're going to be really surprised by what you see here, I think. So while we're at it, while we're talking about this book that was apparently sued, let's have a look at it in context to other books as well. Secondly, and this really cuts to the core of the whole thing, I want to go back to grand jury evidence and look at what the grand jury thought of Steve Thomas's theory, but in a startling way that you might not expect. So I hope this analysis challenges you to think, perhaps to rethink for the first time in 28 years this case along pathways that you've never actually gone down before. And with that in mind, let me ask you an open question. Who was uniquely positioned in this case, besides the Ramseys, to know precisely what was going on inside that house, inside those four walls, month after month, leading right up to the incident? Why do we never talk about her? Why do we never talk about what she knows? In her interview, Vargas seems to suggest Linda Arndt and Steve Thomas were sort of interchangeable. They were sort of at the same level, equally bad, equally mistaken. Two detectives who went down the wrong rabbit holes. And it's as simple as that. It really isn't, because it's very, very different. Linda Arndt seemed to have her Paul on the road to Damascus moment right there in the Ramsey home. But remember that she was stressed, she was alone, and she was apparently afraid as well. But the archive of information that she drew from was relatively small, a very small but vital pool of experience in terms of this case. And her mindset seemed to be shaped in a single moment and reinforced by events that rippled in a couple of minutes and hours leading up to that moment. She was also less hands-on in the aftermath of the case than detectives like Steve Thomas. Remember, Steve Thomas also participated in the first formal interviews with both Patsy and John in April 1997. Did you know that? Steve Thomas interrogated John and Patsy in their very first interviews. But let's assess this idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If Steve Thomas's theory isn't entirely accurate, does that mean his book is a waste of time?
Far from it.
Let's examine the criticism of Steve Thomas now through two dimensions. The book narrative firstly, and then via what I call the source. Number one, the book narrative. Have you ever considered how and why Steve Thomas came to believe what he believed? You might say, well, I disagree with him, but how did he believe what he believed? What led him to believe what he did? Or more particularly, who? Any idea? And if you've read his book, a book Vargas laughs at and seems to malign, it's actually an excellent book if you've read it. It has the most reviews by far of the entire pantheon of books on John Bonet. That's quite an achievement. It's got 1,452 reviews and almost the highest rating of 4.4 out of 5. That's still a very, very high rating. The next most reviewed book is Kolar's Foreign Faction. It's a bestseller right now on Amazon. It's got over 1,200 reviews and the same high rating as Steve Thomas's book, 4.4 out of 5. Kolar's book basically presents a Burke did it scenario, among others. That makes this book, his book, distinct from Steve Thomas's book. The next most popular narrative is Schiller's Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. It has less than half as many reviews at 570 as Thomas and Kolar. And I think its relatively lower rating of 4.1 out of 5, this is just my opinion, is because it tries so hard to remain neutral. It tries very hard not to commit itself to an opinion on the Ramsey case, despite exhaustively covering all the minutiae and every milestone in pretty astonishing detail. And you might say, I don't really like the fact that Schiller has not committed himself one way or the other. But if you think about it, both Steve Thomas and Kolar have effectively been sued by the Ramseys. Kolar for his participation in the CBS documentary and Steve Thomas for writing the book and saying what he said. And so essentially Schiller's book is the first book on the Ramsey case, certainly written early on, where the author wasn't sued. The Ramseys' own book is well rated at 4.5 out of 5, but it is less than half the number of reviews of Schiller's book. So it's apparently not as well read, perhaps not as popular as the other books on this list. Certainly right now, it's not doing terribly well. Right now, it has an overall ranking on Amazon at 85,154 in books. Steve Thomas's book is ranked 17,510 in books. Kolar's book is slightly behind at 21,611 in books, and Schiller's book is at 143,349. So do you think the reading public think that Steve Thomas's book and Steve Thomas's story is worth laughing at, sneering at, making a mockery of? I think it's fair to say that most of the readers out there don't think Steve Thomas is as ridiculous as Vargas and Berlinger seem to think he is, and frankly, I don't either. And by the way, I do think the Patsy Did It theory is absurd, but I don't think Steve Thomas is, and I want to explain why. Why that contradiction? It's actually quite fascinating. Incidentally, Vargas is an author herself on a book about herself, also known as a memoir. It's well reviewed and with over 4,000 reviews was pretty popular when it came out. I don't think really comparing her book ranking on Amazon at 326,830 in books is fair, because not only are these totally different categories, but the Ramsey case is also a hot topic right now. I'm sure when her book came out, it was a hot topic. But I do think it's interesting that you have one author with a book out there criticizing another author, and I mean right now that author's book is doing much, much better than her own. I just think that's maybe relevant to, certainly to any discussion about books. Anyone want to know which are my best reviewed books? Well, Black Star over Bethlehem 3, it's rated 4.6 out of 5, which really makes it one of my all-time best rated books. Sequence Star isn't too bad either, with a 4.4 star rating. Now, suppose if you add all 11 of the reviews of my books together, cumulatively, the entire canon comes to over 900 reviews. Not too bad, right? And that canon would place third on this list, below Foreign Faction, but above Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. I don't know if that's a fair comparison, though. What do you think? And of course, there are other Ramsey books too. I'm only including those in this list that I've actually read. And that brings us to number 2, The Source. Who do you think the source is? We know for a fact that Steve Thomas spoke to the Ramsey housekeeper. Have a look at this excerpt from the 1997 police interview. Steve Thomas: Patsy, once we were told that Burke at times would walk through the house whittling, and that was something that apparently got on Linda Hoffman's nerve somehow to clean up after him. Linda Hoffman is obviously the housekeeper. Patsy Ramsey, right. Now she's not saying very much here, right? Steve Thomas, was this consistent with his little pocket knife? Patsy Ramsey, yeah. Steve Thomas, he'd walk through the house whittling, and for the tape, I'm showing Patsy a photo of a little red Swiss Army knife. Patsy Ramsey, right. He had one we had gotten him in Switzerland. It had his name on it. Does this have his name on it? Steve Thomas, I don't know. Patsy Ramsey, you don't know? Okay. Steve Thomas, and I've spoken with Linda, and she's identified this suitcase as belonging to, well, not necessarily belonging to, but a suitcase that she has used and that John Andrew has used and that John Andrew likely had left at your house. Patsy Ramsey, right. Steve Thomas, do you recognize that blue suitcase? Patsy Ramsey, yes. It's also interesting how Linda seems to remember things differently to John Ramsey. For example, who the suitcase belonged to. Apparently the intruder might have brought that with him as well. Well, that's now. Now that amnesia has set in, now it appears we can allow for that possibility too.
Is this even your suitcase? Do you know what this is?
Yeah, it's been so long ago, I don't know if that was our suitcase or not.
But that's not what John said in 1998 or what Patsy said in 1997 or what the housekeeper said in 1997. Tell me, are we really so incapable of seeing evil even when we're looking at it right in the face? Are we really so bad at subtlety that when you remove even a few of the dots that you're trying to join, you end up with a ruined symphony, a galaxy of falling stars? So can you see this is yet another instance of how the narrative seems to be evolving over time. Now, you, like Vargas and Berlinger, might snigger and snort at Steve Thomas's theory that Patsy Ramsey was involved, but the housekeeper who testified to the grand jury basically testified to that as well. And guess what? The grand jury essentially preferred her testimony, the housekeeper's testimony, to Lou Smith and John Douglas's theories. Lou Smith is the hero, of course, of the Netflix series, but the grand jury didn't find him as compelling as the housekeeper, possibly because she lived and moved and interacted directly with the entire family inside their home, whereas Lou Smith never did. And so this is, I believe, the how, the where, the when, but more specifically the who of what led to Steve Thomas believing what he ended up believing. Look at this article in the Denver Post. Ex-housekeeper says Patsy Ramsey killed JonBenet. A federal judge Thursday gave grand jury witnesses permission to talk about their secret testimony, prompting the Ramsey family's former housekeeper to declare that Patsy Ramsey killed her 6-year-old daughter. Former Ramsey housekeeper Linda Hoffman-Pugh, speaking publicly for the first time about her testimony before the Boulder County grand jury, told reporters Thursday she thought Patsy Ramsey had killed JonBenet. Both Steve Thomas and the housekeeper were using excellent information, first-hand knowledge, in some cases first-hand experience, and some very intimate facts. They were basing what they were saying on what someone saw directly. Unfortunately, they took this very detailed, very important information and, in my opinion, misapplied it, very likely because of the governing psychology that whoever wrote the note killed JonBenet. Going back to the article, the grand jury seemed to zero in on Patsy Ramsey, and she thought it would indict her. A Swiss Army knife was found in the basement room where JonBenet's body was found. Only Patsy could have put that knife there. I took it away from Burke and hid it in a linen closet near JonBenet's bedroom. An intruder never would have found it. Patsy would have found it cleaning out clean sheets. Now, I have a different interpretation here, where she says only Patsy could have put that knife there. Well, not if Patsy gave the knife to Burke. Pieces of rope were tied around JonBenet's neck and wrist when her body was discovered. The blanket wrapped around JonBenet's body had been left in the dryer. There was still a Barbie doll nightgown clinging to the blanket, so it had to have come out of the dryer recently, according to the housekeeper. Only Patsy would have known it was in the dryer, she said. An intruder never would have found the door to the basement room where JonBenét's body was discovered. It was too difficult to see unless someone knew it was there, she said. Now, unlike Linda Arndt, it seemed to take the housekeeper a while for the penny to drop. At first, I didn't want to believe that Patsy could do such a thing, said the 57-year-old Platteville resident, who now delivers newspapers. I loved her, meaning I loved Patsy, but as time went on, things came to me that made me think she did it. I want Patsy Ramsey tomorrow to look in the mirror and say to herself, I killed JonBenet. And those were the housekeeper's words at the time. Now, I disagree with them, but one of the most insightful comments from the housekeeper is this one. She said that she told the grand jury that Patsy had become very moody right before Christmas of 1996. I think she had multiple personalities. She'd be in a good mood and then she'd be cranky. She got into arguments with JonBenet about wearing a dress or about a friend coming over. I had never seen Patsy so upset. It's quite an interesting comment about a friend coming over. I wonder which friend JonBenet wanted to come over, and I wonder why that might have been a problem. Then she said, I don't believe Patsy meant to kill her. I truly believe it was an accident that just continued, said Hoffman-Pugh, who worked in the Ramsey house until 3 days before the slaying on December 26th and testified before the grand jury in January 1999. This is actually very astute reasoning from the housekeeper, that it wasn't intentional murder, something Steve Thomas has echoed as well. I actually subscribe to the same idea, that whoever killed JonBenet didn't do so on purpose. And that's very different to these cynical journos and documentary filmmakers who see nothing but creepy pedophiles coming out of the woods and someone deliberately, purposefully, and quote-unquote professionally executing JonBenet. Pfft, don't make me laugh. This article also clearly states who the housekeeper thought wrote the ransom note. What do you think the answer is? Because if anyone knew, wouldn't she know? Wouldn't she be in the best position to have a good idea of who wrote the ransom note? Because Patsy left her handwritten notes all the time. I mean, wasn't that what the writing pad was there for to begin with? And why not? Patsy had majored in journalism at West Virginia University way back when. Going back to the article, Hoffman-Pugh on Thursday handed out a packet of what she said were 6 handwriting experts' analyses of Patsy Ramsey's handwriting samples. All 6 said it was highly probable that Patsy wrote the ransom note, which was found in the Ramsey house about 6 hours before the body was found in the basement, she said. Hoffman-Pugh said she's convinced Patsy wrote the ransom note. The Ramseys have never produced a written handwriting report, Hoffman-Pugh said. Now, I'm not sure if that part is accurate because, I mean, we know that Patsy gave something like 5 samples, and so maybe that simply wasn't presented to the grand jury. But to give you an idea of just the importance of the housekeeper's testimony, she testified for 8 hours before the grand jury. Her attorney, Darnay Hoffman, said a written handwriting report from the Ramseys is the single most important piece of evidence that's still missing from this case. The only thing they've given is an oral report and oral denial, and I think that is as far as he was aware. In the same report, which has been scrubbed online, and we only have it because another publication republished it, while we see apparent confirmation that a third Ramsey investigator did testify, Ellis Armistead. I do wonder whether everything in this report is accurate. By the way, does anyone not know who Jane Harmer is? She's a very underestimated investigator in this case. If you want me to talk about her, let me know in the comments. In this analysis, I wanted to show you just how rubbish the sneering attitude to Steve Thomas is, and as far as I'm concerned, how misinformed it is, where journalists come to a story after the fact and then in hindsight think they know so much better than the actual investigators. In this case, even the grand jury, they feel they know better than the grand jury who heard so much of the evidence over 13 months. And so the journalists think they know better, even in a scenario where the case remains unsolved.
Do we really think that with a garrote around her neck, a very sophisticated choking device, and do we really think that over a bedwetting incident, which is Steve Thomas's theory, that, in a fit of rage, John Bonet was accidentally killed by her mother because she wet her bed.
Yeah.
Ask them who they think killed John Bonet, and I can almost guarantee they'll say they don't know. That is, in a sense, arguably the dumbest position of all to have, especially if you've been covering this case for 28 years. Ask John Ramsey today who he thinks killed John Bonet. I think I saw an interview where he was asked that and he said, I don't know. So mocking the detectives won't solve the case. And if there's a strategy to fail, to intentionally fail to solve the case, this is the one we see repeated again and again by John Ramsey year in and year out. But hey, apparently it's still the best strategy out there in the minds of the media. Let's tell that tired old story again. The police botched the investigation. There was a media circus. It was so unfair. And let's pretend it's brand new and crow gleefully about our intelligence vis-a-vis everyone else, even while failing to say anything new or original about a 28-year-old case. Really? Mocking the police won't solve the case. But it sure feels good, don't it, Netflix? I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.